One time there was a mom, she was taking her 4-year-old daughter to school, and this mom, she was a doctor, so she was raising her child, and she had really hoped, like a lot of times what happens, we all have hopes for our kids and what we want them to be growing up, and she got excited one morning because she noticed that her 4-year-old daughter had picked up a stethoscope off of the seat, and so she thought to herself, okay, this is exciting. My daughter, maybe she wants to be a doctor like me one day, and so she gets excited and she starts asking her questions, but her daughter wasn't really paying attention. And then finally, after a few minutes, her daughter starts speaking, holding the stethoscope up to her mouth. She goes, "Hello and welcome to McDonald's. May I have your order?" Um, I like that story because you know what, all of us in here, we have hopes for our children, but in some ways though, when we think of the word hope, we kind of maybe have the same concept or the same idea of hope as this mom did, and that is that it's something that we hope will happen but probably won't. That is not at all what the definition of biblical hope is. And I've kind of referred to this over the last couple of weeks as we've gone through this series, and I'm going to dig a little bit more into this today because I think that many of us are hoping in the wrong way. And so that brings up this question: do we not thrive? And this series is called Thriving in Babylon. Thriving in a culture, thriving in an environment that can be challenging. Is the reason why we don't thrive because we don't hope well? That maybe we're hoping in the wrong way. Today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to meet these three guys, and we've already met them. We've met them before, but we're going to learn more about them now, and that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, this story was probably one of the first stories I learned when I was a kid. I can remember the story and that they were put in the fiery furnace, and we're going to get into all of that. We're going to look at what happened in the story. But something that has really impacted me over the last few years with this story is not so much the actual activity within the passage, but what was it that was behind the story? What was it that drove Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be willing to go into a fiery furnace to put their lives on the line? What was it that drove them to be able to have that kind of faith? Because frankly, and I'm sure you're in the same place too, frankly, I want that kind of faith. I want the kind of faith that's going to stand true to God and His Word, even when the worst of things come my way. And these men did exactly that. And so I think for us the question is, how are we going to stand up? How can we hope well and be able to stand up in our own furnaces? Because every one of us in here today, we all have our own furnaces. It may not be like the one that they stood in, as we're going to read today, but we all have our own struggles. And sometimes it comes with a health issue or finances. Sometimes it's in our relationships or problems at work or in our family. We've all got these furnaces, and how do we continue to remain hopeful even when the fiery furnaces come our way? So I'm going to be reading from the NIV today. I'm going to be in Daniel chapter 3. We'll have it on the screens. I'd encourage you to look in if you have a phone or a tablet and you want to look through the Bible app. But I'm going to go ahead and read it, and I'll stop in a few places of this really profound and interesting story. It says there in verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. When I looked at this verse this week, I'm like, wow, Nebuchadnezzar's got a really short memory. Because if you remember what happened back in Daniel chapter 2 that we looked at last week, when Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar said that Daniel's God was wise. But here we are, and he's already setting up false gods. So he's a kind of a forgetful guy. He summons the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. And so all these people, right, they all come together and they assemble for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and then they stood before it. And then in verse 4, the herald loudly proclaims, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And therefore, look what happens here. It didn't take them long. As soon as they heard the sounds of the horn and the flute and all the instruments, all the people, the nations, and the men of every language, they fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, when I looked at this week, I'm like, evidently it didn't take much convincing. It didn't take much convincing for them to worship this false god. And I'm sure there were a lot of reasons behind it. Some of it was that some of these people owed a lot to the king. They didn't want to make the king mad. But my guess is that most of them bowed down to this false god, to this idol, because they were afraid of dying. They did it out of fear. Now we see here in this passage, and we've seen this already in Daniel 1 and 2, that Nebuchadnezzar truly was an evil man. He did a lot of evil things. Remember, he was going to kill all the wise men just because they couldn't tell him about a dream. And that's probably on when he was having a good day. We know that he brought people from other nations. He would often kill countless thousands of people when he would take nations captive. And so what we see here is that Nebuchadnezzar, not only his evil, the evil of who he is, but we also see that Nebuchadnezzar was very narcissistic. There's a lot of debate about this statue and what exactly it looks like, but most people think that the statue was probably made very, very similarly in the image of Nebuchadnezzar. So here we have a man who is saying, okay, everybody, I'm putting up this statue, and I want you to bow down and worship me. And really, when you think about it, evil and narcissism, oftentimes they can come together. As we look back throughout history, and even people that we've run into in our own lives, we've run into people that make a lot of bad choices. And a lot of it comes, again, from selfishness and narcissism. So we see that going on here with Nebuchadnezzar. And so he decided, hey, I'm going to consolidate my power, so I am going to create a religion. Now, there's an interesting side note here. There are many people who question whether certain events in the Bible really happened. But what's interesting, about 50 or 60 years ago, they actually found the site where the pedestal, in other words, the area where the statue would have sat, they have found it in this area of Susa, as it mentions here, in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So nonetheless, we could see again where God's word comes true here, and we see that what God is illustrating to us through Nebuchadnezzar is what can happen when a man becomes all about himself. And so he forces this new religion on everyone, and he uses the national orchestra to do it. He uses music in order to tell everybody that they needed to bow down to him. A professor that I had many years ago, his name was James Smith, once said this. I thought this was such a good insight. He said that not even the Creator coerces outward acts of submission to heavenly authority, yet earthly tyrants require absolute allegiance, virtual worship from their subjects. I thought that is quite interesting. That God, if you look at how God works in our world, he doesn't force anybody to worship him. Yet we see here, and we've seen it in others, the Romans did the same thing. Even in more recent times, such as Hitler and Nazi Germany, where you had pictures in every room and classroom, where it was almost this forcible worship of a person. God never does that. God says it's up to you. He wants worship from us, but it's a choice. So here Nebuchadnezzar is trying to force them into worship him. And while most everybody bowed to the king, and remember, even many of those who were forced into exile, they bowed out of fear, we then meet these three guys that didn't do it. So let's keep reading here. Verse 8. It says, at this time here we go. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. So they're kissing up to him. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, all these instruments, the national orchestra, that they must fall down and worship the image of gold, and then whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But guess what, Nebuchadnezzar? There's some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Their names, these guys are like, they're turning them, they're narcs, right? Like, all right, they're turning them in. They're saying they're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They don't pay any attention to you, king. They don't serve your gods. They don't worship the image of gold you set up. Now, why would they do this? Probably because they were jealous Again, narcissism, jealousy. They had seen the promotion these men had, and so they thought, here's our chance to bring them down. Here's our chance for Nebuchadnezzar to put them in their place. I mean, actually, in this passage, you can see what the Jewish nation has often had to deal with, and that's anti-Semitism. If you get into the deeper text, and when you look at the original language, this term in here, in verse 12, it says some Jews, is actually a very derogatory term. They just had a major problem with Jews, and so what they did was they lumped into this group that many of that period hated. They get these three guys as kind of the personification of the hate that they had for the Jewish nation. And so they are able to go before Nebuchadnezzar, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are then accused of disrespecting the king and refusing to worship their gods, and specifically this golden image. Well, look what happens with Nebuchadnezzar in verse 13. He is ticked. He is furious with rage, which we've already seen in this book. This guy's got an anger issue, okay? He's furious with rage. Nebuchadnezzar summons these guys, and they were brought to the king. And in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, he says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, when you hear the national orchestra, all these instruments, when you hear it, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, good. I'm glad that you'll do that. But if you do not worship it, you are going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. Then look at this. Wow, this is a dangerous question right here. Look what he says. He says, then what God will be able to rescue from my hand? Now that's some narcissism, isn't it? In essence, he's saying, I'm more powerful than any of your so-called gods, or God in their case. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. And this, I think, is the key verse in this whole chapter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Saying this to the most powerful king, with their lives on the line. We've seen here in this passage that Nebuchadnezzar, he just erupts. He interrogates these men. He's angry with them. And he even tries, if you look here, he tries to give them a way out. He says, here, I'll give you another chance to worship this false god, this statue. And he warns them that if they don't, that their God, he in other words, he's taunting God. Well, the response of these three men, I think, is the example to us. It's the example to us of how we stand firm in faith. I don't have this written down in your notes if you're taking notes today, but I think there's some things that we see here. First, you notice that these men, they didn't apologize for their actions. They knew that what they were doing was right. See, that's how we stand firm. We don't apologize for what God has called us to do. Now, yes, we do apologize and we do seek forgiveness when we've done something against God's word. See, they knew the penalty was coming, but they feared God more than man. So we know that they didn't apologize for their action. They also confessed their allegiance to God here. They knew that God had been with them. Remember, they had gone through a lot, just like Daniel, who we've talked about the first 2 weeks, or the first 2 chapters of the book. They had been through a lot. They had been taken from their homeland, but God had not left them, and they knew it. And so they were going to remain allegiant to God even in this moment. You know, one of the dangers that we have as followers of Jesus is that when times get tough, we can sometimes be a little bit like Peter and some of his disciples who ran from him. We can be maybe even ashamed or deny him like Peter did. But these men were not going to do that because they knew that God had power. They were assured at what God could do. They knew that God was sovereign, that he had total power over the world. They were confident in God's grace. They knew that God could deliver because of his very nature. See, these men, what I think the most powerful thing about this passage isn't so much about what we're going to read about here in a few minutes. It's about these men's relationship with God. They were able to thrive in Babylon because their commitment to God and their understanding of who God is and their relationship with God reminded them of how good he is. And so they were unconditional. They were unconditional in trusting God. I love what it says in verse 18. They said, you know what, even if I die, my faith is not any different. I'm going to believe in God just as much if I live or if I die. Nothing is going to change my mind. But there's something else here in the midst of their response. Because I pointed out to you in verse 17, I think it's the key verse here. If you look kind of between the lines here a little bit, if you look at what they're saying there in verse 17, you know what I see there? I see hope. They have the type of hope, biblical hope, that God wants all of us to have. Not the kind of hope where, oh, I hope this happens, but a hope of, I know this is going to happen, thus I hope. I know that it's taking place and that it's going to take place. You know, when we think of hope, it's something that, like I mentioned, it's something it might not be, but the biblical concept is so different. You know, we might say, I hope my team wins, which I said that a lot of times during the Bengals, you know, when they were bad all those years. I was like, I really hope they win. But deep down inside, I knew they weren't, right? Okay? Okay? All right? Now, I will say this, and maybe this might cut a little bit, but I hope a little better now as a Bengals fan, because we're better. Now, some of you Colts fans all the way. But anyway, all right. No, I had to put that in there. Sorry, guys. I know some of you probably won't even listen to me now. I probably just ruined the message. They're like, I can't believe he just said that. But anyway, but no, I mean, many of us have this kind of hope where we think, oh, you know, I hope it. No, this isn't what it is. I like what I've found this week. Hope, biblical hope that's truly defined as this. It's an expectation of the fulfillment of something desired. It's expecting it to happen, not wishful thinking. So let's see how this hope goes for these three guys. Let's continue reading. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace, now look at this, he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. So this guy has definitely got a temper, he's got an anger issue. And what he does is he commands some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up these 3 men and throw them into the blazing furnace. And so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the fiery furnace, the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. So if it wasn't any more evident that Nebuchadnezzar is mad, he makes a furnace 7 times hotter. I mean, that's like turning up the thermostat in your house to like 500 degrees when it's set at 70, right, or whatever. I mean, he was incensed. He was angry. He was so angry, he was even willing to sacrifice some of his best guards to throw them into this furnace. And so here these men are thrown into this furnace, and they stand there. And I was trying to imagine that moment for them as they're in this furnace and they're bound up at first, although we know that later the ropes and stuff were burnt away. But can you imagine the smell and the sound and the heat of being thrown into that furnace? I'm sure that we might be tempted to think that in that moment maybe they were starting to second guess themselves a little bit. But that isn't at all what happens. These men were committed to God. They knew that God had what was best for them. And then in verse 24, it says that King Nebuchadnezzar, though, after throwing them in which, by the way, I think I have a picture. Do we have a picture? I think I found a picture. So I could not really find a really good picture to kind of illustrate what this furnace looked like. This was maybe about the closest I could find. You know, when we usually think of a furnace, we think of them kind of, it's on ground level. Most people think that actually it was kind of a hole in the ground where there was a huge fire that was enclosed. And so they were thrown in from above. And that brings us here because it says that Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw to the fire? And they said, well, certainly, King, there was 3. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And then Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High... Boy, things have really changed here, right? Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire, And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the advisors crowded around them, and they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Now, we don't know exactly the length of time that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fire, but we do know they were in there for some time. So I'm imagining here that I'm the King Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm so filled with anger and hatred, looking down, hoping these guys just get burned all up, right? Because I'm so mad about it. And I look down in amazement. He's probably sitting up there as evil as he was. Maybe he's up there sipping his favorite drink, thinking, all right, I've rid us of these guys who are really going to cause me problems. He looks down, and they're all just fine. And not only that, there's a fourth person in there. Somebody else has joined in on the party. And you know who's joined in on the party? It's Jesus. We know that because of some of the things there in the language. For instance, Nebuchadnezzar himself says he looks like one of the sons of the gods. There was something different about him. And actually, we know that throughout the Old Testament, there are these events that happen that are called Christophanies. We've all probably heard the word theophanies. These are appearances of God. Well, a Christophany is an appearance of Jesus. And that's who is standing right there in the fire with them. We know that there are many Christophanies in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, we know that Abraham, Jacob, Hagar, even Gideon, the language shows us that Jesus appeared in those instances to each of these characters in the Old Testament. And what really floors me here, and what really gives me hope, biblical hope, real hope, is that Jesus didn't stand outside of the fire and say, hey guys, it's going to be all right. What did he do? He was right in there with them. And you know what? He's going to be right in there with you too. No matter what furnace you're going into right now and you're standing in, maybe it's a furnace of your own doing. Maybe it's a furnace that's been put on you. It doesn't matter. Jesus is going to stand right in there with you, and he stood right in there with these three guys. You know, if you think about it, in many ways, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were never closer to Jesus than they were in the fire. For many of us, the closest we get to Jesus is when we're in the fire. And I think if that's the case, then that gives us a different perspective on the fires that we have in life. Rather than maybe always seeing them as a negative, it's an opportunity. See, that's what hope does. Hope changes what a fiery furnace looks like. Instead of it being a place of dread and a place we avoid, it can actually be a place where we are the closest to Jesus. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego experienced here. Well, we know that finally, if you look here, the fire is squelched, and then they come out, and the passage says that they're perfectly fine. It even goes to the point of saying they didn't even smell like fire. I don't know. That's amazing to me. If I stand here at a campfire for like 2 minutes, my clothes, they didn't even smell like it. And then look here in verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar says, and boy, has his tune changed. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, which, by the way, God did not ask for this, okay? All right? And their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Even though Nebuchadnezzar was definitely coming at this the total wrong way, what he says there at the end is true. No other God can save in this way. And then look what happens. We see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are promoted in the province of Babylon. Now, when I look at what happened in Daniel 2 and I look at what happened in Daniel 3, and I see Nebuchadnezzar's responses, I think, oh, okay, maybe this is the place Nebuchadnezzar comes to faith in God. And I want you to know that there's no evidence of that, okay? When we look through the rest of Daniel and some other places in the scriptures, We don't really see that. It seems like Nebuchadnezzar was the kind of guy that he might be able to recognize power, like he did in this story that we looked at, or recognize wisdom, like we saw in Daniel 2, but he never had what is most important, that is a true relationship with God. And we can fall into that same trap. We can maybe be amazed at what God does or what God's word says, but really it's about a relationship. And it's through that relationship with God that we grow deeper and that we truly understand who he is. That's how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to stand in the furnace and to have hope, because they had that relationship. And so what I want us to think about today is how important, and I want to share with you this point here today, and the point today is this, is kind of very similar to what we talked about last week. That God uses people for prayer. God wants to bring hope to us. You know, they show us what can happen and how we can thrive when we are challenged in our faith. I'm sure that some of you, when I refer, in my messages from week to week, I refer to the original languages and stuff. I'm sure some of you kind of gloss over, and I get that. But there's something really interesting about the word hope in the New Testament. There's these two words, we'll put them up here for you. There's these two words in the New Testament. Actually, I'll put one of them up, and this one's elpidzein, which means a hope that is present. You know, when I was in English class, I can remember being bored out of my mind about tenses and verbs and nouns and all these things. I'm sure I'm probably bringing back some bad memories for some of you, because I did not enjoy that. But let me tell you, if there was ever a time that is important for you to take tenses and verbs seriously, this is it. Because of what this word means. This word hope, as it's described in the New Testament, is not one that is in the future. It's one that is now and in the future. It's present and it's future. In other words, our hope, and if you look here, it's not an adjective, it's a noun. The word hope is a noun. What does that mean? It's a person. Our hope is a person. Our hope has already come. Our hope is already here. Our hope we already have. And we will always have. And that hope is Jesus. See, it was at his resurrection that hope was born from death. It was through the fire that hope was proven reality through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the thing is it can be really easy in our lives to put our hope in something or someone else. And really, that's what confronted these three men on that day. Are they going to place their hope in their salvation in a man by bowing down to a false statue? Or like it is for us, are we going to place our salvation in the hands of a person or a concept or an idea, or as crazy as this might sound and as weird as it sounds, in a politician or in a political party? I mean, what are we putting our hope in? Because many of us fall prey to what most of the people of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's day fell prey to, and that is putting their hope in someone or something else other than God himself. And have you ever noticed that when you've done that in your life, how it always comes up short? That person, it fails you. That politician you voted for that you thought was going to change everything does nothing. But the fact is when we put our hope in God, we can know that he's going to come through. And that's how we can have hope. That's what biblical hope is that we know he's going to come through. I love what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. They said, you know what? We know he's going to come through whether he saves us or not. Because his plan is what's right. His plan is what's good. And that's the kind of hope that we are called to have as Christ followers. One time there was a young man who was in a job interview. He was talking to a human resource person, and he asked this young accountant, and this young accountant was just fresh out of school. He says, what starting salary were you thinking about for your first job? And the accountant said, well, I was thinking in the neighborhood of about $100,000 a year, depending on the benefits package. And the interviewer says, well, what would you say to a package of 5 weeks vacation, full medical and dental benefits, company retirement fund to half your salary, this executive's share option scheme, profit-related pay, a company car leased every 2 years, and let's just say that it's a 5 Series BMW. What would you say to this whole package? And the accountant, he's like, whoa, this is a great package. He says, are you kidding me? This is great. And the interviewer goes, yeah, I am kidding, but you started it, all right? When he said that he wanted a $100,000 salary right off the start, right off the top. The amazing thing is that while jobs and salaries and people can seem like fancy, unfulfilled, just these unfulfilled hopes, we know that Jesus is hope. And that Jesus will not let us down. He will literally stand with us in the fire. Paul says in Romans 8, not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemptions of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, what do? He says that we wait for it patiently. See, Paul's getting at this idea of the hope that we have and the hope that is still to come. And I'm asking you, where is your hope? And how do we have hope? I want to just give you 3 quick things here. First, we've got to seek God's heart. The reason why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to stand in that fire is because they knew God's heart. And you know what? When life feels hopeless, and even when it isn't, even when you don't feel hopeless in life, drawing close to God is so important. Because he wants to have a meaningful, deep relationship with each of us. We seek him through prayer. We seek him in the Word. We seek him in worship. We seek him through service. God wants that in us. He wants us to seek his heart. When we seek after his heart, it's going to be a lot easier for us to hope in the biblical way. Something that Paul points out there in Romans 8 is we have to be patient, though. Be patient when you wait. While Jesus is hope and we have him now, we know that there are some things that haven't happened yet. There's a lot of things that I look forward to. I was sharing at a funeral I did yesterday that, every morning, one of the things I say, I kind of sit on the edge of the bed for a few seconds before I get up, and I always say, okay, Jesus, I hope today is the day. I said it again this morning. I hope today is the day. There are some hopes as part of my hope that haven't been fulfilled. So we have to be patient. It's a willingness to wait for an answer, a solution, or change. That waiting period, by the way, and this may not feel like this sometimes, but the waiting period is not a punishment. Waiting for something. When I'm sitting at the doctor's office and I'm sitting there for an hour, sometimes that can feel like a punishment. Okay, like what did I do to the doctor that I got to sit here for an hour? That's not the way God works, because it's through our waiting that God is working. One more thing. Expect the unexpected turnaround. Don't be surprised when God does something that isn't expected. The Bible is full of stories like this. And you know what? He's already done this. You know it's true. He's done this in your story. There's been things that's happened in your lives that you just never thought would happen, and boom, they did. That's what God does. So what's to say that he won't do that again? He will do that again. You might have to wait. But he will do that again. Because, see, hope is the catalyst for the victory that we have in Jesus. In times when everything appears to be completely hopeless, we can confidently stand in the security of Jesus, knowing that he is not finished working in our lives, working in our world. And see, the Lord works for your good. We know that. Romans 8, right? Works for the good of those who love him. So here's what I want to encourage you is to learn how to hope better. Here's the challenge for you. Find somebody in your life who is hopeful, who is positive, who is upbeat, who has a great relationship with Jesus. There's people in this room that you probably know that are like that. There may be people in your family or out in our community. Sit down and talk to that person. I don't think we do this enough. Maybe somebody that's further along the road in their walk with Jesus. Sit down and talk to them and ask them, how do you do it? How do you stay so upbeat and hopeful when everything just goes to you-know-where, right? How do you do that? Talk to them. Talk to them. Find those people to talk to in your lives. And see how you can incorporate some of what they say in your own. Because here's the thing. We will flourish in our lives when God's hope nourishes us. We flourish when God's hope nourishes. I'm going to close with a story that I think is so good. There was a woman one time who was dying, and so what she did was she contacted her pastor, and he had him come to her house to discuss certain aspects of her final wishes, such as her funeral and where she would be buried, things like that. She told him which songs that she wanted sung at the service, the scriptures she wanted read. But the woman also told her pastor that she wanted to be buried with her favorite Bible. Well, everything was in order, and the pastor was preparing to leave when the woman suddenly remembered something important to her. She said, "Hey, there's one more thing," she said excitedly, and the pastor was like, "Okay, well, what's that?" And she said, "This is really important. I want to be buried with a fork in my right hand." Have you heard this story before? It's such a good story. The pastor stood looking at the woman. I mean, what do you say to somebody who wants to be buried with a fork? I can think of a lot of things I'd want to be buried with, probably not a fork. Pastor, he's like a little puzzled by this. The woman says, "In all my years of attending church socials and functions where food was involved," and let's be honest, she said, food's an important part of our church. "My favorite part was when whoever was clearing away the dishes of the main course would lean over and say, 'You can keep your fork.' Which, it was my favorite part because I knew something better was coming, that there was dessert on the way, right? When they told me to keep my fork, I knew that there was going to be, it wasn't just going to be Jello or pudding or something, that it was going to be something good." And so she said, "I just want to, when I'm lying in my casket, I want to be holding a fork in my hand, and I want them to wonder what's with the fork. And then I want you, pastor, to tell them this, that something better is coming, so keep your fork too." I love that. You know what? For us as followers of Jesus, we've got it good in our relationship with him now, but there is something even better coming. Amen? Something better coming. So there's forks in your seats today, and it worked out that we're going to have cake afterwards, so you can use your fork for the cake today too, right? Wow. God is just amazing, isn't he, how he works these things out? Okay? But I want you to just think for a minute of what is still to come. See, that's the hope that we have. That's the hope that we have of what is still to come. And it's not a fanciful dream or wish. It's something that is true. It's something that is real. It is something that will happen. And so with this, I want to just close you with this, that hope is real. It is not an idea. It is in a person. And hope is him. Hope is Jesus.